All right, welcome to the chapter on social stratification. Just a reminder, make sure you have your textbook open. If you need to pause this video, then pause it. But you need to have your textbook and something to write with or take notes because that's what's expected as you watch this lecture. So we're going to be in chapter 9 on social stratification. That's going to be on page 242, starting on page 242. So let's just jump right into things, and I'm going to walk you through a PowerPoint that I have, and what we're going to do is we're going to mix PowerPoint with me writing on a board, and you'll see that here in just a moment. But we're going to start out with talking about social stratification and what we mean by that. So let me make that a little bit bigger. That's about as big as it's going to get, about right there. So, okay. So starting out, social stratification, as you're going to see on page 242, is a system by which a society ranks categories of people in a hierarchy. Okay. So what we really are dealing with here is dimensions of power. And so as we start back here after spring break, we are going to be talking about social stratification for much of the rest of the semester. So our next several chapters will deal with these kinds of topics. So what I like to do is, starting out in chapter 9, is to talk about what social stratification is and sort of lay the groundwork of what we will be talking about in this chapter. And this chapter is it actually mixes some basic terminology about what social stratification is and how that relates to inequality. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. And then in this chapter, it also talks in great length about social class. And so there are generally 3 dimensions of social stratification, 3 or 4, that we focus on in modern day sociology in the United States. That is social class, race and ethnicity, gender stratification, and inequality and stratification by sexual identity, sexual preference. So this chapter, in chapter 9, as I mentioned, it will introduce stratification and inequality, and it will also talk about social class. And then the next chapter we're going to cover, I believe, is the chapter on gender stratification. And then we're going to cover the chapter on race and ethnicity. So all these terminologies that we're going to talk about in this lecture are going to apply not just in this chapter, but in the next several chapters. So we have a scope of work that we're going to cover as it relates to stratification and inequality over the next several weeks. So the first thing I want to talk about is how these terms of, let me move this over just a little bit. There you go. We want to talk about how stratification is different from inequality. And so stratification, and you're going to see much of this on page 242 and 243 of your textbook, but stratification, we want to be clear that it's a trait of society and it's not just a reflection of individual differences, okay? So that might sound a little bit odd. Oftentimes when we talk about stratification, and we're going to write this on the board here in just a moment, but one major dimension of stratification is social class. And oftentimes when we talk about social class, we talk about, well, I'll tell you what. Let's actually just get to that. Let me show you this. Let's see if we can do this way. Okay? All right, so I'm going to run over here and write some stuff on the board here. Hopefully this is going to work out just as I have planned. So we have a dry erase board. So when we talk about stratification, Mitch, we're talking about social class and race and ethnicity. I will do my best to write legibly. I know you missed that. We also are talking about sex and gender. And those are going to be the major topics that we're going to cover, as I mentioned, the next several weeks. So when you think about social class, I ask you, okay, when you think about social class, what comes to mind? And oftentimes people talk about money. We talk about dimensions of rich and poor. Okay? So we're going to explore that quite a bit in this chapter, a whole lot in this chapter. And then the other chapters coming up in the next several weeks, we will cover these terminologies, okay? So when you think about, well, I mentioned power. How do you get power in society? All right? And this is what we're referring to. Now, this might sound a little bit odd, race and ethnicity and sex and gender. But we're going to come back to that, as I mentioned, okay? But most of the time when we talk about these items in class, and we talk about how you get power in society, money is usually something that comes up pretty often, okay? So we're going to be talking about dimensions of power, and we're going to start in this chapter talking about social class. But before we get too far into this, let's talk more about stratification and inequality. So, back to looking at our slide. Stratification, again, is a trait of society, not just individual differences, okay? So how is stratification built into society? And again, that's something we're going to explore. Stratification is universal. So in any society that you go to, wherever you have civilization, you're going to have stratification. You're going to have some people that have more power than others, all right? I think folks that lean to thinking about people's rights and equality, racial equality, income equality or inequality, this usually is something that they struggle with, right? So, for example, those that want to have equality in society, that's a political, usually something that's tied to political ideas and that sort of thing. Well, you're not going to have equality in society. This is a very interesting thing to think about. Why do societies have inequality? Why aren't people equal to one another in society? And so this is an interesting dynamic you start thinking about. Well, is some degree of inequality good for societies? Maybe not for individuals, right? So maybe inequality is not good for individuals, but maybe it's good for society, okay? So there's several dimensions here of stratification that we want to consider. And as you can see in that third bullet point, you almost can see it. It involves beliefs. Let me move this over just a tad. Let me try to move this over for you real quick. Okay, we'll just leave it right there. It involves beliefs. And for example, how do we rationalize inequality, stratification in society? How do we explain it away? How do we make it to where it's okay? Okay. So, hold on just one second. I had a timer I was going to set when we start, and I forgot to, so I'm doing that real quick. Okay. All right, so now we want to compare and contrast stratification with inequality, okay? So here's where stratification, as a term, as terminology, as an idea, stratification and inequality are certainly related, okay? They go hand in hand. But you're going to have stratification in every society. But the degree by which you have stratification, that's what we're going to call inequality, okay? And so as you see here, inequality varies by culture. So we've got this objective idea of stratification. Any society you go to where people live together, you're going to have stratification. That's how human societies function. You're going to have some people that have more power than others. Okay. We might get to that a little bit when we get to the chapter on that has government involved in that. All right. But you don't have the same amount of inequality in every society. So you have stratification, you're going to have ranking of people in a hierarchy, ranking according to power. Right? And generally, when you look at around the world, when we think about ranking of power and we look at different societies, we think about these things. By the way, I'll get that glare fixed a little bit. Okay? But in every society in the 21st century, we generally have differences based upon social class, race, ethnicity, sex, and gender. Now, it's not, perfectly descriptive according to social class, race, ethnicity, sex, and gender. It varies by culture. So you have some societies that are more likely to have inequality based on social class, or some societies that are more likely to have inequality based on race and ethnicity, and some societies have more inequality based upon gender or sexual preference. And so, again, the last bullet here, it's variation on social power. So how do you get power in a society? And again, in the United States, as that's in some ways being illustrated with the coronavirus, those that have more power have more access to resources. Well, how do you get power? Okay. And so you could hopefully begin to see, the interesting idea here about, well, how do you get power? How do you get access to money? How do you get access to being rich or poor? Is that something that is an ascribed status or an achieved status? I wish that we were in class, because that is something we would talk about. Is social class an ascribed or an achieved status? Right? And that's something that we're going to explore a little bit more in this chapter. If we were in class, we would talk about this. We would say, okay, well, some people are born into wealth. I don't have any control as a young child which social class I'm born into, but does it matter? Does it matter if I'm born into wealth or if I'm born into poverty? And so then you start thinking about socialization and access to resources. So this is something that we're going to spend a little bit more time on in the next lecture, okay? Is it achieved status? Well, we like to think in the United States, in the American dream, in order to get wealthy, all you have to do is work hard enough and do the right things and you get wealthy. Well, ideally, maybe we like to think society is that way, but when we start looking at the research around this, we're going to see that there's something more than just whether or not your work ethic, your education, having the right job. There's other things that are at play in order to get access to those kinds of things, okay?